Last week, the Health Justice Initiative won a court application to access South Africa's COVID vaccine contracts and discussion documents. During the height of the pandemic, many pharmaceutical companies who had invested billions to rapidly develop effective vaccines were able to negotiate extremely favourable deals with countries desperate to protect their citizens. But with a lack of transparency on the details up to now, concerns that countries like South Africa may have paid too much or taken on legal responsibility for any damage that might have been caused by administering the jabs. Well, the HGI has now begun combing through those contracts, and they say they're finding a pattern of big pharma bullying South Africa. And I'm joined by Fatima Hassan of the Health Justice Initiative. Fatima, thank you so much for joining us. And it's so important that we understand what was negotiated in these contracts. You've had various teams going through a number of different contracts, 4 main ones, I understand. I wonder if you can just break down which contracts you've been looking at and the broad patterns you're seeing.
Thanks, Sally. So remember that the court ordered that the contracts and agreements had to be handed over, as well as all the negotiation minutes and documents with other parties as well. So what we've received is the first part of that set of documents, and that's 4 contracts or agreements with 4 companies. Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, as you know, those are the 2 companies that most of us use vaccine supplies from. And then what's called Gavi and the COVAX initiative. That's a Geneva-based not-for-profit initiative that was meant to ensure equitable supplies for countries in the global south. And then we also have the agreement for the Serum Institute of India, which was a version of the AstraZeneca vaccine, which, if you'll recall, a decision was taken by the South African government to pause that rollout, but an agreement was entered into. In the next few weeks, we'll be receiving additional documents from the department, and it's really encouraging that they chose not to appeal this judgment and actually comply with the court order. And those documents will be all the negotiation minutes and the discussions with other companies as well.
So some of the information that we've already had on air suggests that we paid well above the price that other countries paid. Some of the information that we have is that South Africa paid 1/3 more than the African Union for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Do we know why?
So in the absence of all, the balance of the documents, I think that's difficult to speculate. But I think what it points to is a pattern of take it or leave it. These were the prices that were demanded by Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson and COVAX and Serum. And in all 4 cases, we found that there were real concerns about the way in which they actually dealt with the conditions related to pricing. We also found, when we compared to what other countries have paid, that there are some, on the face of it, prima facie suggestions that there may have been preferential prices offered to other countries, but not to South Africa. And our calculations, based on what's in the agreements and what's in the contracts, is that in several cases, we may have actually overpaid. Now, there were rumors and there were reports about this that have been circulating for the past 2.5 years. But now we've actually been able to see the terms and conditions of these agreements.
And then the other thing that I was astonished, because this is one of our BRICS partners, we paid the Serum Institute of India 2.5 times more for a generic version of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine compared to what the UK paid. Now, I have to bring in here the reality that a lot of wealthier countries made some upfront payments. So that would have assisted, I would imagine, some of the research. And for that upfront payment, they got some preferential treatment. Has that been factored into your calculations that we were charged 2.5 times more?
Yeah, so, I think there's a number of issues around this. In some cases, a myth that it was only the companies that actually put money on the table to research and develop the vaccines. You'll remember that the so-called AstraZeneca vaccine was actually developed by researchers at Oxford University. and then an agreement was actually entered into with AstraZeneca. But in the absence of a proper pricing analysis, proper details around the true R&D costs, the true additional costs, what you have is a situation where you have these agreements, you have differential pricing structures and systems in the middle of a global pandemic, where different countries are charged different prices, and the public is none the wiser as to the reason. So people speculate. But what we also found is that even though, for example, countries in the EU didn't necessarily contribute towards the R&D for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, they were also charged a lower price. So I think what it points to a system that is so untransparent and also doesn't make sense. It's so uneven that it basically is based on who negotiates in the strongest way, what the negotiating powers are. And so there's a number of complex issues that we've lifted up in these agreements and contracts, not just on the price, but also around the down payment conditions, around indemnification provisions, around the companies demanding that they would keep either half of the down payment even if they couldn't deliver. There's no penalties for late deliveries or non-delivery. So there's a number of factors which cumulatively, if you put it all together, for us suggest a pattern of bullying. And it's something that we have been concerned about for the last few years. And it actually shows a situation where even though commitments were made to the Global South during this pandemic, what we're seeing in the agreements is very far from that.
Is it bullying? Or was it just Big Pharma trying to make the masses of money back that they put in to developing these vaccines? Billions and billions were put in. To be fair to them, were they not just trying to make their money back, or does it look like they made an insane profit off these vaccines?
Look, so there's an element of profiteering and there's, a serious element of pernicious bullying. And again, I just want to emphasize that it wasn't just Big Pharma putting billions of dollars or pounds on the table. There was a lot of public investment. There were efforts by the UK and the US government. We, for example, participated in 4 clinical trials. So there was definitely a global effort towards developing these vaccines. I mean, we can go into the long debates about who actually developed the mRNA vaccine, what was the role of public scientists in that, how that was actually discovered using the knowledge that actually came from a public health institution in the US. So, but that aside, I think apart from the issues of profiteering, you have a situation of bullying where you say to a government, if you want these vaccines, then we may be able to deliver, we may not, but you can't penalize us. We want an advance payment. We want within a week or a few weeks for you and your government to set up a rapid vaccine injury fund, which you must underwrite. And unless you meet all of these requirements, we won't deliver a single vaccine. And on top of that, we won't allow anybody else to make a vaccine, which Sally explains why for months we were waiting for the vaccines when we were facing multiple waves of infection. And during that time, those vaccines were being sent to Europe, right? So when we talk about the power and the power of allocation and the power of not being able to penalize any of these companies for any kind of non-delivery or reallocation of supplies. I mean, we even needed their permission if you want to sell it on, if you want to donate it to a third country. And so it is very unusual contracting compared to other procurement contracts for health products. And I think it sets a very dangerous precedent. We certainly cannot have this in the next pandemic.
You touched on something that I do want to bring in. I think it's really important, and it was, and now as you've gone through the contracts, this was always the thing that the individual countries who bought the vaccines had to take on sole responsibility for any vaccine injuries. As it happens, there have not been a huge amount of vaccine injuries, but it was an extraordinary risk for countries like South Africa and other countries to take. Compared to what our South African laws say about procurement of medicines and of vaccines, were these contracts actually even lawful? And if they weren't, does that mean they could be challenged, overturned? Could we sue?
So, the basis on which we've approached this case is we've never said that anything illegal has happened. What we've tried to do is shine a spotlight on the power that the industry enjoys, not just in COVID procurement, but also potentially for what's going to happen on NHI procurement. These are the same issues that are playing out in procurement of HIV medicines, of TB medicines, etc. So, that's our starting point and that's our end point. But I think, you raise an important point about how did we have a situation where the companies had so much power that they were able to bully not just us, but many countries in Africa, many countries in Latin America, where even the contracting parties' details were secret. When you look at these contracts, there are confidentiality provisions that provide that if a court orders disclosure, that wouldn't constitute a breach. So there were definitely provisions contained within these agreements which made it really difficult for our government to ensure transparency. And you'll remember that government did say at that time they had to choose between their citizens and between the demands of these companies. So I think, again, it goes to the bigger systemic issues of how have we got ourselves into a situation in the middle of a pandemic where 5 or 6 CEOs have so much of power that they can even decide whether you can donate or sell on supplies. So much of power that they decide the price alone, you can't question it, you can't analyze it, that they would get, balances of their advance payments out, and there's no penalties or consequences for them if they don't deliver or if they don't deliver on time. So, I think there's some serious problems about how we regulate private conduct. And also, how was it that we had a government that had to defend the secret procurement in a constitutional democracy? And that goes to, I think, what you said about, don't we have rules about transparent and open procurement in South Africa? How did we get to this point? I mean, why did an NGO have to take government to court to get access to full procurement agreements? It's just beggars belief, I think.
Yeah, and thank you so much for telling us what you've uncovered so far. And as you've mentioned, there is, of course, more documentation to come. So I'm sure we will be chatting to you again in the near future. Fatima Hassan of the Health Justice Initiative, some very troubling information coming through, suggesting really that while, of course, a lot of money had been invested by these vaccine companies, there's a strong suggestion from the information that's come through so far that South Africa was bullied and was made to pay more than was fair. This story, of course, has got lots still to come on it, I suspect.